intellectual space. At last I get my chance at a Parkland conference to really let some things off my chest. So that's what I'm using for the 15 minutes, and we'll turn it over to Stage Left Productions. Okay, and if Bill Phipps is here, is he here?
He will be in a moment.
Okay, well, this is for him. And I say that because you know he's going to be launching a book this afternoon, and I think he might find my remarks pertinent. I hope he does. At 15, I announced to my parents one Sunday morning while we were all dressing for church that I did not believe in God and would no longer accompany them to church services. So that's the first line. It's better. My mother said, "You're too young to decide that." And that does seem to have been that for a few more years. As a teenager, what had been pulling at my heartstrings were issues of what we now call social justice. I did not yet suspect that I might be called on to act in the world, but Lord, I believed. I cheered Fidel Castro. I read George Orwell with deep conviction, and Anne Frank's story crushed my heart. Hungarian refugees tossed up in my elementary school haunted me with images of their desperate flight from Russian tanks in the cobblestone streets of the old country, caught behind what we call the Iron Curtain. As did the display of black and white photographs in the windows of the Hudson's Bay Company store on Jasper Avenue of the wretched camps of the Palestinians dispossessed of their land. Then, as a part-time hippie in the 1960s, I found myself living among people. Do I have to shout? Actually, I might. Am I shouting?
You're doing very well.
Thank you. I'm so used to having to shout. Okay. Then, as a part-time hippie in the 1960s, I found myself living among people who sat in lotus position during solemn rituals of getting stoned, and who I began to think were immeasurably more evolved than I. And I briefly became interested in the books they kept in their Afghan tote bags. I remember Alan Watts's Nature, Man and Woman, Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, and the I Ching, around which we gathered to throw Chinese coins over and over and over again until we decoded something that made sense. But in fact, it is true. I have spent most of my conscious life as a secular humanist, receptive to movements that followed on my adolescence. The New Left, the counterculture, feminism, Canadian cultural nationalism, dissident movements in Soviet and East European countries. I found solace not in spiritual practices, but mainly in political texts and the songs of Bob Dylan. And I should say, at one point, when I was still living in Toronto, I actually went on Sunday mornings to a reading group of Marxism-Leninism. And I suspected that faith in the transcendent was some kind of luxury for the lucky few who knew how to pray. It did not occur to me that this longing for the transcendent might be generic to human beingness itself, which is, I think, what Mark is getting at. And I've been rethinking this, especially while reading Karen Armstrong's book, The Battle for God. It's her study of the emergence in the late 20th century of fundamentalism, or what we might call militant piety, in every major religious tradition. And Armstrong's thesis is simple. In our modern era, people all over the world are trying to find new ways of being religious, or spiritual if you like, now that the old way of understanding reality is no longer accessible. And what is that old way? And Armstrong means the balance that traditional societies had between what she calls mythos and logos as the two complementary ways of arriving at truth. Mythos was primary for them, concerned with the timeless, the eternal, the universal. And unlike logos, or rational investigation, myth was not concerned with practical matters, she writes, but with meaning. And this still has significance for us moderns, for, and I quote her, unless we find some significance in our lives, we mortal men and women fall very easily into despair. She mentions, among other writers of the 19th century, industrial France, Charles Baudelaire, which sent me immediately to Wikipedia, You don't even have to get up and go over to your bookshelves anymore. To find out more about Charles Baudelaire, who I did read as a French literature student, an undergraduate, and we all, of course, all actually did read his poems at the same time in the 60s, Les Fleurs du Mal, which were published in 1857. And the French even have an adjective, Baudelarien. And from his poem, The Sick Muse, here are typical lines of this despair and ennui in the modern world. My poor muse, alas, what ails you today? Your hollow eyes are full of nocturnal visions. I see in turn reflected on your face horror and madness, cold and taciturn. Sigmund Freud, sometime later, analyzed thanatos, or death, at the heart of our culture, as well as eros. And then between 1914 and 1945, 70 million people in Europe alone died violent deaths, mainly in Auschwitz and the Gulag, the places where God was not. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about the God-shaped hole in human consciousness. And note now the rise of jihadi terrorism in failed secular states. Cut off from the practices of cult, liturgy, and ritual, we descendants of the Enlightenment, the scientific revolutions, industrialism, capitalism, and colonialism, have no obvious or tenable means of participating anymore in myth. After all, once you scrutinize the Bible or the Quran or the Torah with a rational mind, all their claims to truth seem false, in fact incredible, or just mere stories, and not of much use beyond our private consolation or for aesthetic pleasure. But of course, as Karen Armstrong reminds us, this is to miss the point of what these texts are about. Creation stories, for instance, are not a historical account of the origins of life, but, she says, a reflection on the ultimate significance of life itself, about which scientific logos has nothing to say.
Bravo.
Oh, much encouraged, she carries on. We have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. If reason alone tells the truth, if truth is only what is demonstrable and verifiable to our intellect, then what do we say about art? Never mind religion, this is how she segues into art. Art, which proves nothing, does nothing useful, and which often doesn't seem even to make much sense. Do we say that artists are crazed fanatics, unhinged nutbars, God's holy fools? No wonder they can't make a living. Then I went last weekend to the symposium here at the University, Arts and Science. I don't know if anybody else went. And the places where they converge, which is what they call the symposium, and what a revelation, if you will excuse the expression. Now, Karen Armstrong argues that the task of religion has been to provide our pragmatic activities, such as architecture, communication, technology, and the law, with ultimate meaning. But now that I've been to that symposium, Arts and Science, I would argue that this is now the task of art. Now that we've cut ourselves off from any other notion of the divine or transcendent. Art is what points us to what is of intangible significance. And you might have seen a recent interview in the Globe and Mail with the architect Daniel Libeskind. And he said of his work that every project would be fallacious if it referred only to itself, or if it sought harmony only in itself. Now, there was a Dr. Alan Lightman from MIT who was our keynote speaker, was the keynote speaker at Arts and Science. He's a novelist, and he's also an astrophysicist, for heaven's sake. He spoke to us at the crossroad of science and the arts to cite the title of his talk. We'd already heard that the interdisciplinarity of ideas will be the most valuable global currency. And we learned that at its founding in 1908, by the way, the first faculty founded at the University of Alberta was known as the Faculty of Arts and Science. They were together under one roof. Nevertheless, there is a distinction, an important one, between arts and science and their procedures. Lightman told us, scientists work by posing a problem, then they break it down, do the research, working with the confidence that there is an answer. But artists don't care about definite answers, which don't in fact exist in art. When questions are more interesting than solutions, you have to relinquish control over the process. Well, you think then that art and science work at cross purposes, but in fact, says like when they occupy substantial common ground. They both seek beauty, harmony, balance, simplicity. And as the mighty Einstein himself acknowledged, scientific observation and experiment don't reveal all there is to know. Imagination, he said, is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. Then was this kind of queer aside to string theory. And apparently the point about string theory is even in science, scientists work with postulates. String theory is about a wholly imagined model of theoretical physics, which postulates but has never observed certain subatomic one-dimensional strings. Now, Einstein welcomed the sense of the ineffably mysterious in our contemplation of existence. He said it is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science. Whoever does not know it and can no longer wonder, no longer marvel, is as good as dead, and his eyes are dim. Actually, they would go the other way around. He also said, never memorize what you can find in books. Now, Dr. Alan Bleakley, head of the Education Research Program for the Peninsular Medical School, Universities of Exeter and Plymouth, UK, said, ambiguity is the province of art. Art problematizes what medicine sees as a problem, end quote. And he also writes poetry, and he surfs off the beaches of Cornwall. Art makes the familiar strange, he continued, and that's a very old and famous quote. Art makes the familiar strange, and promotes ambiguity in representation of reality. And he cited Theodor Adorno, the German philosopher and member of the Frankfurt School, who claimed that at the center of the authoritarian personality is intolerance of ambiguity. And a claim he reinforced at the end of his talk by saying very bluntly, we live in a fascist culture which does not tolerate ambiguity. Finally, in an exciting panel called All in the Mind, Learning Aesthetics and Ways of Knowing, Seattle-based independent scholar Ellen Dissanayake led off with a riveting expose of what she calls the deep structure of the arts, which, as products of Darwinian evolution, are innate to human nature. They are normal, natural, and necessary. Their deep structure has evolved both in the human psyche and within human cultures. Cave paintings were made 25,000 years ago, and compared to this, she said, the Enlightenment was a nanosecond ago. And so human psychobiology has not yet had the time to catch up. Our deep cultural grammar, she said, is still that of hunter-gatherers for whom religion, art, and ceremony pervaded life. I'm sure she'll get an argument from some of the post-structuralist or postmodernist scholars, but that's not me. We may live in cities of strangers, where culture is plural, technology, not religion, is the explanatory paradigm, and the arts are viewed as elitist. Yet deep within us, she said, is the need for art making. In fact, this need may be planted as deep as within the genetic codes of animals. She says, for example, that the display of the peacock's fan tail is ritualized behavior. And within the earliest human ceremonies are organized around issues of life and death. There is no ceremony without art. In fact, ceremonies are collections of art. Think of it. What happens in a collective ceremony? Music, rhythm, dance, costume, color, drama, storytelling. Performed as formal, elaborated, and repeated behaviors, which is just another definition of art making. Clearly, art making is adaptive behavior, for it promotes cooperation and group bonding. No human society has survived which made no art. But what's art for, besides making us more successful in evolutionary terms? And here was where Dr. David Mile of the University of Alberta came in, where he's been measuring what happens when people read a literary text, in his case, Wuthering Heights. Well, they get emotional. Literature's aesthetic elements, he said, disable our normal understanding of events, and they provoke a non-verbal response beyond ordinary comprehension of language. And according to the poet Samuel Coleridge in Biographia Literaria, they do this by awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us, end quote. But there are social implications as well. Reading literature makes us more resilient, enhances our memory, helps us to imagine alternatives to present circumstances. It helps us to problematize issues. Narrative even decenters the self through provoking empathy with others. And I made a little note to myself here saying, so quit going to the gym and go read a poem. In her remarks about the fraught relationship between Western science and indigenous knowledge, Dr. Ellen Bielowski, Dean of the School of Native Studies here at the University of Alberta, managed to sum up everyone else's contribution that day. The most important elements of life, she said, are carbon and metaphor. But one question hung over the auditorium like a fume from a sour gas well. If art and artists are so natural, normal, and necessary, if artists are sensitive to the deepest codes in human society, why are they treated with such indifference at best and contempt at worst? Supplementary question, why are they so damn poor? Alan Lightman answered bluntly that the arts, not being related to capitalistic gain, are viewed as valueless. Ellen Dissanayake echoed him. Babies are ready to become artists, she says, but the capitalist market alienates us from this potential. Ellen Bielowski argued that with the astonishing growth of knowledge over the generations, we have been forced to specialize our ways of knowing, and so artists find themselves in an asylum all their own. But, I say, artists should cheer up. Contrary to popular stereotype, their creativity does not induce madness, drunken and disorderly conduct, and contemplations of suicide. In fact, if art making is really an adaptive behavior from an evolutionary perspective, artists are the healthiest people on the planet, and their genes will rule. Finally, when political scientist Peter Emberley, in Divine Hunger, Canadians on Spiritual Walkabout, which he published in 2002, investigated the phenomenon of so many of the 60s generation searching for spiritual meaning in their middle age, he made this observation: that our youthful commitment to social and political change and to the communities we lived in had been, in part, tools of consciousness through which the divine could now speak. Love and solidarity, hope and compassion. People are always trying to find ways of tapping into the mythical. On the right, we have fundamentalist Christianity. On the left and new left, we have had May Days, the social gospel, folk fests, communes, transcendental meditation, goddess worship, trips to Kathmandu, not to mention sex, drugs, and rock and roll, where we have attempted to sacralize community, labor, and flesh. Even as we have been scared out of our wits by the likes of Pentecostalists, Hasidim, and jihadists, they saw themselves as liberating the notion of the divine from mere human systems of thought. All of them were originally people in a struggle on behalf of all humanity to bring in the reign of justice and compassion, in a rage, like us, against gross materialism, toxic consumerism, and blasphemous abuse of fellow humans. Talk about your counterculture. Decades after my generation's engagement by the great social and political movements for liberation and justice, we turned to churches and temples, to spiritual rites and rituals, and to art making and theater, not as gestures of private despair at the collapse of political and social projects, but as an acknowledgement of the return of the repressed desire in a sickened world for some kind of collective hope and transcendent ideals. And with that, I give you, stay blessed.